You spent years wondering why everyone else seemed to have a manual for life that you never received. For reading a room, for knowing how long is too long to stay quiet, for surviving small talk without a script. Then, later than expected, a diagnosis arrived. Autism, ADHD, or both together, now often called AuDHD. The common belief is that a diagnosis is the finish line, the moment everything gets explained and settles on its own. It isn't. The paperwork ends there. The real work starts after it in what you actually do differently from here. Here are some valuable tips to start. Start with your energy, because most late-diagnosed adults have been managing it wrong for years without realizing it was a finite resource at all. Certain sounds, certain kinds of socializing, certain types of task switching cost you more than they cost other people, and pretending otherwise just moves the bill to tomorrow with interest. Track what specifically drains you for 2 weeks, not generally people or generally noise, but the exact triggers. Open plan offices, phone calls versus texts, unscheduled interruptions, a full day with no unstructured gap in it, 3 social commitments stacked with no recovery day between them. Once you can name the specific cost, you can budget around it instead of being blindsided by it every single time it appears disguised as ordinary tiredness. Renegotiate your relationships instead of quietly managing them alone. Autism researcher Damian Milton describes what he calls the double empathy problem. Miscommunication between autistic and non-autistic people runs in both directions, not from one side failing to read the other correctly. That single reframe changes an old habit. A flat tone doesn't always mean disinterest. A long pause doesn't always mean withdrawal. Telling someone that you process spoken instructions differently, or that going quiet after a conversation means you're thinking rather than pulling away, does more for the relationship than another year of masking through the confusion and hoping they eventually guess correctly. Say the specific thing plainly once instead of managing around it indefinitely and hoping it resolves itself. Next, question routines you inherited rather than chose. The 9 to 5, the open office, the belief that rest has to be earned through sufficient exhaustion first. None of these were built around how your mind actually operates, and very few of them were chosen by you at all. Test quieter alternatives in small, reversible ways. A different work block, a different meeting format, permission to rest before you're depleted rather than after you've already crashed, a different route through your morning that skips the parts that reliably cost you the most. This isn't indulgence, it's you finally collecting information about what you actually need instead of guessing from a template built for someone else's brain, and quietly discarding whichever parts of that template never fit you in the first place. Start separating identity from performance, because masking left most of that line blurred for years. You built a second self. Copied expressions, rehearsed small talk, scripted apologies for reactions you hadn't even had yet. When unmasking felt riskier than the exhaustion of keeping it up. The sociologist Devin Price, who writes extensively on masking, frames unmasking not as one dramatic reveal, but as a slow, ongoing audit. Noticing moment by moment which reactions are genuinely yours and which were built purely for an audience. You don't need the full answer today. You need to start asking the question in ordinary moments and actually waiting long enough to hear a real answer. Begin treating your attention as something with its own rhythm rather than a straight line you keep failing to walk correctly. Research on ADHD, including work by psychologist Russell Barclay, points to differences in executive function, planning, switching between tasks, regulating effort, not a lack of willpower or discipline. If focus arrives in bursts rather than evenly, working with those bursts gets more done than forcing a schedule that assumes everyone's attention behaves identically. Let some tasks sit unfinished in the conventional order. Return to them when the burst comes back instead of treating the gap in between as proof that something is wrong with you. A body of work completed out of sequence is still completed work. Build recovery time into your schedule immediately after anything that required heavy masking, a work event, a family gathering, a day of forced eye contact and constant small talk, the same way you'd plan rest after genuine physical exertion. Most people don't budget for this particular cost because nobody ever told them it was a real one. It is real, and it compounds silently if it's ignored for long enough. Treat it accordingly, and where you have any choice in the matter, avoid scheduling anything demanding directly afterward. Start letting yourself use whatever self-regulation tools actually work, even if they look unusual from the outside. Fidgeting, rocking, pacing while you think, repeating a phrase under your breath, wearing headphones in a quiet room. These are frequently dismissed as habits to grow out of or as something to hide in front of colleagues and extended family, when in practice, they're regulation strategies your nervous system found on its own, often before you had any other option available to you. Suppressing them doesn't remove the underlying need, it just spends energy hiding the visible sign of it. Energy that could go towards something that actually matters to you that day, in a room where nobody was going to notice or care in the first place. Replace self-criticism with curiosity when something goes wrong, particularly the ordinary small things, a forgotten reply, a missed deadline, an overwhelming afternoon that ended in shutdown. Asking what specifically made a situation difficult teaches you something you can use next time. Asking what's wrong with you for finding it difficult teaches you nothing except to expect the same result again. The first question builds a system, the second just repeats the old one. Begin noticing which environments actually work for you instead of assuming the problem is always your tolerance for them. Fluorescent lighting, constant notifications, open-plan noise, and back-to-back meetings with no recovery time weren't designed with your nervous system in mind, and adjusting the environment is frequently more effective than trying to adjust yourself to fit it indefinitely. Lighting changes, headphones, seating position, written instructions instead of spoken ones. Small environmental edits routinely outperform sheer willpower, and none of them require explaining yourself to anyone who hasn't earned that explanation. Give yourself permission to grieve the years spent without this information, without turning that grief into a permanent identity you now live inside. Clinical psychologist Tony Atwood, who has worked extensively with late-diagnosed adults, notes that many arrive at diagnosis already fluent in coping strategies nobody ever taught them on purpose. Entire systems and workarounds built purely through self-preservation, long before there was language for why they were needed. That grief is real, and it deserves space, including the specific grief of realizing how much unnecessary struggle could have been shortened with earlier information. It's also not the whole story, and it doesn't need to be fully resolved before you start building the years ahead differently. Start asking what parts of you are actually you once the performance is finally set down. Identity isn't a fixed core you uncover once and for all. It's built through the choices and habits you repeat over time, the same way any skill is built. For someone who spent years choosing a mask over a genuine reaction, that cuts both ways. The self underneath isn't lost, it's underused. It simply hasn't had enough practice being lived out loud. And every small moment of choosing the real reaction over the rehearsed one gives it a little more practice than it had yesterday. Treat the things you get intensely absorbed in as a resource rather than a distraction to manage. Deep, narrow focus on a specific interest has often been framed as excessive or immature, when it can function as one of the most reliable tools available to you, for regulation, for genuine rest, and occasionally for skill you can put to real use elsewhere. Protecting time for it isn't wasted time. It's one of the few places your attention already works exactly the way you need it to, without a fight. And above all else, start giving yourself the explanation you were owed years ago. Not sympathy and not a diagnosis used as an excuse, but an accurate account of why things that seemed to come easily to everyone else were genuinely harder for you, specifically. That account changes what the rest of the story means, including the parts that already happened. None of this erases the years spent without this information, but it changes what you do with the years still ahead of you. The self you've been managing, hiding, and apologizing for was never the problem to solve. It was the part of you nobody had properly introduced you to yet, and it still deserves the manual you never received, even if you have to write it yourself, one specific, ordinary choice at a time, starting now.